Abraham Lindup, a name you've never heard, I'd wager. Born into obscurity at the foot of Mount Cop on the Tunstall side in 1738, it would seem Lindup were destined for a life of anonymity. A nondescript man who spent most of his early life working as a farm labourer. However, this was to change, for in 1760, Lindup would have an encounter that was to change the course of his life. Abe had travelled to Burslem, one of the Pottery's 6 towns, where he came across a large crowd gathered around a preacher. Just so happens, this preacher was none other than John Wesley, the founder of what would later become known as the Methodist faith. Abraham found himself transfixed, captivated by Wesley's words. They resonated deep within him, lit a bit of a fire, you might say. But alas, it seems the majority of the crowd did not share in Lindup's newly found perspective. For you see, at the time, Wesley's doctrines were seen as somewhat radical, a gross deviation from the teachings of the Anglican Church, and were therefore viewed with fear and suspicion by the common laity. Wasn't long before the crowd turned ugly, jeering and heckling. Some even threw clods of dirt at Wesley, one of which hit him square in the face. Well, that just wouldn't abide with our Abe, and filled with a newly found sense of a righteous purpose, he waded through the crowd, grabbed Wesley by the hand, and led him to safety. From that moment on, Lindup dedicated himself to spreading the word of Methodism throughout the Potteries. Now, our Abe, he weren't a natural preacher, not the most charismatic bloke, you may say, but for what he lacked in charisma, he more than made up for in sheer blooded mindedness and righteous zeal. His attitude was, if he couldn't win over the people by God's love, he'd do it by the threat of damnation, which, as you can imagine, had a tendency to rub people up the wrong way. One incident in particular sticks out. One afternoon, Abe, along with 2 brothers and converts to Methodism, a Mr. George and Job Ridgway, had been preaching to a somewhat tempestuous crowd up at Biddulph Moor. After the sermon, they began to make their way back to Tunstall, but it soon became apparent they were being followed by an 8-strong gang of men. Wasn't long before they were overtaken by the group, who proceeded to hold them up on the road. Of course, Abe tried to reason with the mob, but it quickly became apparent that they had violence in mind and wouldn't be dissuaded, by words at least. Now, back then Staffordshire were a rough county, beset by crime, and with no standing police force. You had to know how to handle yourself. Life in the Potteries bred hard folk. Abe and his 2 compatriots, George and Job, were no exception. So when one of the mob made to attack Job, he was deathly quick in his reaction, slamming his fist into the man's face, dropping him like a sack of shite. Another made to accost Abe, and by way of thanks got a swift right hook to the jaw. The rest of the mob were seen off by George, who had drawn a cudgel he carried. On sight of the thick length of polished wood, the gang soon reconsidered their actions and fled off into the night. The 3 would later claim that it was God's strength that had given them the power to see off their assailants. Fighting the devil with his own weapons, as Abraham called it. But it would be stranger circumstances that would make Abraham Lindup's name. Some years prior to the encounter I have just described, a small Methodist chapel had been built about 3 miles outside of Tunstall. The Methodist father of the church lived in a house close by. He were an exceedingly superstitious man, and had become convinced that one of his bedrooms was haunted. One evening after preaching at the chapel, Abe went to visit the church father at his home. The two had been chatting for a while when the subjects of ghosts came up, the church father stating vehemently that one of his bedrooms was haunted. Abe, being a no-nonsense kind of fellow, was somewhat sceptical and brushed it off as foolishness. But the church father was insistent and invited Abe to spend a night in the haunted room. Reluctantly, Abraham agreed, and after supper was taken, the two men turned in. Abe found the room to be fairly nondescript, like any other bedroom he'd stayed in. He settled in without incident and was soon fast asleep. However, later that night, something awoke him. The distant chime of a bell, followed by the low whisper of a voice. "Abraham Lindup," it said, "you are wanted at the chapel." Abe sat up sleepily. Rubbing his eyes, he looked around the room. There were no one to be seen. So he did what any man would do in that situation. Turned over and tried to go back to sleep, groggily muttering, "Why should I be required to preach at this hour?" But again, the voice spoke out, more urgently this time. "Abraham Lindop, get up immediately. You are wanted in the chapel." "Then I shall not come," Abe snapped back irritably. But the voice would not be dissuaded. "Abraham Lindup, if you do not come, you will answer for it and repent it every day of your life." Well, that got his attention, and quick as a flash he were up and out of bed. "How am I to find my way?" He spoke to the dark. "Trust me, I will guide thy way," came the reply. And so it was that Abraham Lindup was led down the house's winding staircase, through the kitchen and out the door, into the dead of night, 100 yards over the weather-beaten moorland, until finally he arrived at his destination. To Abe's surprise, he found the chapel were already lit, strange for the time of night. But he paid it no mind, pushed open the doors, and trudged slowly up to the pulpit. Though he could not see clearly into the congregation, he sensed the presence of a large crowd waiting for him. That disembodied voice came again. "Abraham Lindup, you are wanted to preach." Unperturbed, Abe took hold of an hymn book that was resting on the pulpit, but to his surprise, he found he could not move it. It seemed fixed in place. That's when he heard it. The guttural sound of mocking laughter, singing out from dozens of infernal throats. Peering out from behind the pulpit, he now saw the congregation that had been waiting for his sermon. And what a ghastly congregation it was. A host of demons and devils, seemingly vomited up from the very bowels of hell itself. All horns, teeth and gibbering mouths, their sulphurous green eyes, burning in the dim light. Of course, our Abe were terrified. This weren't some village mob he were facing, but the very legions of old Nick himself. The poor preacher cast around the chapel, searching desperately for a means of escape. But alas, none presented itself. Nay, so great was the infernal cacophony that Abe felt near paralysed, as if bound by cold iron bands. But as we know, Abraham Lindup weren't a man to be cornered, for that was when he were at his most righteous. It was at that moment the voice spoke again. "Be not afraid, Abraham Lindup." Staring hard into the infernal throng, he spoke out. "Friends, as we cannot use the hymn book, we shall sing a little song from memory." Once again that mocking laughter rang out from the pews, but he was not to be deterred, and recalling from memory an old Methodist favourite, he began to sing. At the sound of the preacher's words, the demonic rabble began to shriek and shout, trying with all their might to drown out Abraham's hymn. But his voice rose high above the tumult, each note filled with a righteous zeal. And by the time he had finished, the chapel was silent. The devilish host, nowhere to be seen, fled back to hell, their forked tails between their legs. In later years, Abraham's strange encounter would be recounted by a one Henry Allen Wedgwood in one of his series of local character studies that appeared in the Sentinel in the late 1870s. Henry Allen Wedgwood is an interesting figure in and of himself, the grandson of the famed master potter Josiah Wedgwood, and brother-in-law to the arguably even more famous Charles Darwin. Yes, that Charles Darwin. Origin of species and all that caper. Henry Wedgwood speculated that Abraham's strange experience were likely down to an heavy supper and going to sleep in an unfamiliar room suspected to be haunted, which is a fair observation. However, Wedgwood later wrote, "In after years, no persuasion could ever make Abraham Lindup believe what he had witnessed was a dream. To him it was a real fact, and he used to say that night was the grand battle between Satan and Methodism in that place, and he was proud that Methodism came off more than conqueror. Many a sermon did that dream furnish with him, and he always related it to his friends with an awe that impressed those who heard it. So what is clear is that whatever it were that our Abe saw, be it a dream or some strange hallucination, he believed in it and would not be persuaded otherwise." Abraham Lindup died at Tunstall on March 11, 1832, aged 94. Bookie's odds are his descendants still live in around the Potteries, for he sired 4 sons and 5 daughters, had 79 grandchildren, 74 great-grandchildren, and 3 great-great-grandchildren. According to Wedgwood, his end was as peaceful as his life had been laborious. Good to know, I reckon. So that were Abraham Lindup. An interesting fella, to be sure. Not many who can say they delivered a sermon to demons, now is it? Though it feels that way when I ring the bell for last orders sometimes. Anyway, you know where I am if you need out. Just ring that bell and give us a thumbs up. Have a good 'un. I'll be seeing you.